Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to discuss one of the most famous arguments against moral realism. This is the queerness argument, which was first presented by J.L. Mackie in his book Ethics Inventing Right and Wrong. So the basic idea is that moral properties are weird in a way that's supposed to be problematic, and that's why we shouldn't believe in them. As we'll see, there are many ways of elaborating on what this weirdness supposedly involves. Mackie himself distinguishes two parts to the queerness argument. There is a metaphysical part and an epistemological part. So, let's start with the metaphysics. Mackie says, and I quote, "If there were objective values, then they would be entities or relations or qualities of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe." So, we think that slavery is wrong. According to moral realists, this belief is true, and it is made true in virtue of objective moral properties. Right? Slavery has the property of wrongness. But what on earth are these? What is this property of wrongness? Whatever it is, it's not like any of the other things that we believe in. It's hard to fit moral properties into the rest of our worldview. Then the epistemological part of the argument is this. If we were aware of objective values, it would have to be by some special faculty of moral perception or intuition, utterly different from our ordinary ways of knowing everything else. Supposing that these queer moral properties really existed, the only way we could have knowledge of them is through a queer cognitive faculty, a faculty unlike any of our usual faculties for forming beliefs. So, Mackie says, it's much better to deny moral realism. There are no objective moral values. Our moral judgments do not involve detecting objective moral properties, but rather involve projecting our attitudes and values onto the world. So when I say slavery is wrong, when I make the judgment that slavery is wrong, this is a kind of projection. I'm like projecting my own repugnance, my own negative attitude towards slavery. I'm not detecting some property out there in the world. So this is the basic statement of the argument, but what exactly is it for a property to be queer? I mean, on the one hand, this does, I think, capture one of the basic intuitions that drives anti-realism. On the other, as we'll see, it's tricky to make this argument precise. Now, before turning to the argument itself, it's worth saying something about the target of the argument. For Mackie, at least, the target of this argument was moral non-naturalism. Many philosophers these days endorse moral naturalism, the view that moral properties are simply natural properties. For example, a simple kind of moral naturalism would say that moral, like goodness, is just pleasure, badness is just pain. You want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So when I say that slavery is wrong, this just means that slavery tends to produce pain and suffering, and nothing more. Now, most moral naturalists will give more sophisticated accounts than that, but that should give you a flavour of the position, right? I have videos in my series on metaethics that examine moral naturalism in more detail. For the purposes of this video, it's just worth saying, if moral naturalism is correct, then clearly the queerness argument doesn't get off the ground. There's nothing, Mackie didn't want to be targeting properties in general, right? Clearly, like there's nothing queer about pleasure or pain, at least in the context of metaethics. Very few people doubt that there is pleasure and pain. But Mackie has other objections to moral naturalism, which, again, you see my video on moral naturalism for a summary of some of those objections. Okay, so the queerness argument is targeted against non-naturalism, the view that moral properties are distinct from natural properties. So it may be the case that, pleasure makes something good or pain makes something bad, but the goodness and the badness are distinct from, they're not just pleasure and pain. Okay, with that said then, let's turn to the argument. Now, the metaphysical part of the queerness argument is the part that has been the most influential, and so that's what we'll spend the most time on. But we can begin by noticing a basic worry about this kind of argument. So Mackie says that if there were objective moral values, they would be properties of a very strange sort. And this invites the question, so what? Who cares? Many things in the world are strange. Just look at wave-particle duality, or desert varnish, or Fata Morgana images, mirages, or mental imagery. Like, what on earth is mental imagery? I mean, I can form in my mind's eye a mental image of blue. I see it vividly. It's vivid blue in my mind's eye, yet at the same time it's unseen. No change occurs in my visual field. It seems to exist in this ghostly space behind my visual field. It's somehow both seen and unseen. Somehow that it's both vividly coloured, yet there's a total absence of colour. I find mental imagery to be a profoundly bizarre and alien experience. So there are many strange things in the world. What's the problem with adding moral properties to all of this? Well, Jonas Olson, in his book on moral error theory, suggests that one important difference between moral properties and these other phenomena is that these other phenomena are only prima facie queer. So, if you take something like a mirage, well, yeah, that's strange, but we can explain these mirages in terms of our scientific theories of optics. We can fit these phenomena into our best theory of the world, and this reduces the strangeness. Now, of course, the problem with this kind of move is we might well think that those theories that we're fitting the phenomena into are themselves strange. I mean, certainly this seems to have been the reaction that many people had to, our best scientific theories when they were first proposed. And even to this day, there's a lot of theories, quantum mechanics, for instance, that continue to baffle even the people who are experts with them. So it's not entirely obvious that fitting these everyday phenomena into these strange theories reduces the strangeness of the phenomena. So this is just a general problem, right? I mean, why does it matter if something is that can't just be the end of the argument, right? The argument can't just be, well, moral properties are strange, moral properties are queer. We need to identify some specific feature of them that makes them problematic beyond just that. So, okay, when we say that moral properties are queer, what is this really supposed to amount to? Well, first of all, moral properties are not naturalistic in the sense that they do not appear in any of the empirical sciences. So, on the one hand, we take it that moral properties are properties of actions. Now, actions are performed by human beings. Human beings are ultimately composed of fundamental particles, as described by our best theories of physics. When we want to understand how human beings work, we need to look at physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. And when we do that, we don't find any moral properties. And it seems like we wouldn't be able to find them. Sciences tell us how the world is. They describe how it actually works. Morality tells us how the world ought to be. The empirical sciences provide causal models of phenomena. When we perform experiments or make observations, we are uncovering the causes of things. But moral properties, in the view of most non-naturalists at least, moral properties are non-causal. So slavery is wrong. The wrongness of slavery doesn't have any causal powers. For these sorts of reasons, morality cannot be made scientific. And the notion that the world contains these properties outside the domain of science, causally isolated from the physical phenomena, is queer, we might think. Now clearly something along these lines must be the right analysis of moral properties if what we're targeting is non-naturalism. But this seems like it's merely a description of the position, not an objection to it. So, non-naturalist realists will be happy to accept that, yeah, moral properties are not postulated by the empirical sciences. That's fine. That's not an objection to moral properties. Ethics and science are simply different domains. And in any case, as we've already seen, there are plenty of properties postulated by scientific theories that are profoundly strange, like wave-particle duality. So the mere fact that moral properties are not the sorts of properties uncovered by science doesn't really tell you anything one way or the other, the moral realist might say. All right, let's try a different tack. So one worry we might have is that moral properties are in some deep way inexplicable. So what I mean by this is that we're not able to give a reductionist explanation of them. We can't break them down into simpler parts. in the way that I can, for instance, break a human body down into simpler parts to show how all the parts fit together. Like if I take a body, I can show the different parts of which it's composed. I can show like the organs, the muscles, bones, and so on. Then I can show how those parts function together to produce the whole thing. To produce a human body. It doesn't seem like moral properties are not subject to this sort of reductionist analysis. Similarly, we can't say anything about where moral properties come from. Like, why do these things exist? I mean, as many realists see it, moral properties necessarily exist. They could not have failed to exist. If it's wrong to torture innocent people, then it's wrong in all possible worlds to torture innocent people. So there's no story to be told about how moral properties arose. And so this, we might think, suggests that they are queer. Now, there's two issues with this. First of all, the realist may say, as before, that there's just nothing even prima facie queer about this situation. Reductionism and causal explanation are appropriate in some domains. They are appropriate in the domains of empirical science, where we are dealing with physical objects in the causal order. But we're assuming that moral properties are not like that. And in any case, there's different kinds of explanation, right? So in some sense, we actually can explain moral properties, and this is the task of ethics. So suppose we say that abortion is wrong. Well, in that case, there's presumably going to be some explanation of why abortion is wrong. We should be able to cite the features of abortion that make it wrong. The wrongness of abortion doesn't just float free of all other properties. It's not just like some sort of brute fact. Abortion is wrong. If it's wrong because of some reason. Maybe we say, well, it's wrong because it involves killing a being with a future like ours. And then we can, explore this further. We can say, well, what makes it wrong to kill a being with a future like ours? And we can give some further explanation, right? So we might think, okay, wrongness, at least the wrongness of some action is not in general inexplicable. It's not subject to the sort of reductionist explanations that you find in the sciences, but it can be explained in other senses. A second issue here is that inexplicability is a feature even of many aspects of a naturalistic ontology. So think about things like the fundamental laws of nature, or fundamental particles, or a question such as, why is there something rather than nothing? If you take a law of nature, I can't break a law of nature down into more basic parts. A law of nature is not an object that is composed of anything. It's something that governs the behavior of objects. Similarly, I can't break a genuinely fundamental particle. If we've identified the fundamental particles, like the bottom layer, as it were, I'm not going to be able to break that down into further parts either. It may be the case that there just is no further explanation of why the laws of nature are the way they are, or why the fundamental particles have the properties that they do. At some point, it seems inevitable that we will, just have to postulate certain things that are not explained further. Explanations can't go on forever. So even if there is a sense in which moral properties are inexplicable, we might think that doesn't make them queer. Okay, so a different way to develop this point about explanation is in terms of explanatory dispensability. So basically the thought is, well, we just don't need moral properties in order to explain anything. Moral properties are dispensable. And this is an important difference between moral properties and things like, laws of nature or fundamental particles. We may not be able to give a further explanation of so I may not be able to take a fundamental particle and then break it down into simpler things to show how how those simpler things compose the particle. Fine. But we postulate certain fundamental particles because they help us to explain various observations. Moral properties, by contrast, are inert. They don't play a role in explaining any of the phenomena we encounter. So we can appeal to principles like Occam's razor. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. Do not postulate a wholly new type of property that's unlike any other property unless it pulls its weight in explanation. So we have an argument like this. We should believe only in those entities that play a role in our best explanations of phenomena. We do not need to postulate moral properties in order to explain anything, so we shouldn't believe in moral properties. Now, one point to make about this is that this type of explanatory argument is contentious. So there are some realists who will say, well, actually, no, moral properties do have explanatory power. There are like ways that they play roles in our explanations. I've discussed this in other videos in my meta-ethics series. I think the more important point for us here in this video is it's very hard to see how this is a queerness argument. So there are many things that I don't believe in. For instance, I don't believe that aliens have visited Earth in the recent past. Why not? Well, partly because there's just no reason to postulate that it happened. There's no observation or experimental measurement that would be best accounted for by postulating an alien visitation. Of course, people can point to things like, UFOs or testimony from certain people who claim to have had some sort of involvement with aliens, but I think that there are much better explanations available for such phenomena. Okay, here we have, a debate, right? There are people who believe that there is good evidence of alien visitation. I disagree. But, even if I'm right, this doesn't make alien visitation metaphysically queer, right? When I object to the arguments for alien visitation, I'm not making a queerness objection. Indeed, it's possible that aliens could have visited, right? Yeah, there could be intelligent life on other planets. Interplanetary travel isn't completely out of the question. There are. I think that the hypothesis of alien visitation is a very poor explanation, but it's not as though the idea of aliens visiting our planet is in some way, metaphysically problematic. So with moral properties, the problem isn't simply that they don't pull their weight in our best explanations. That doesn't capture the queerness intuition. That doesn't capture the supposed weirdness of moral properties. Right then, quick advert. So, if you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon. I upload bonus videos on there, so you get to see more stuff if you do that. You can support me with a donation on PayPal. I offer private tutoring in philosophy, and I have a Discord. So links to all of that will be in the description. Right. Let's get on with it then. Let's look at some more arguments from queerness, more ways of developing the queerness argument. So Jonas Olsson, in his book on moral error theory, distinguishes four different versions of the queerness argument, three different versions of the metaphysical queerness argument. So first of all, there's the supervenience argument. There is a general consensus that moral properties supervene on non-moral descriptive properties, and we say that A properties supervene on B properties just in case there can be no change in the A properties without a change in the B properties. So think about, for instance, an image displayed on a computer screen. The visual properties of the image supervene on the properties of the pixels. There can be no change in the shape or colours of the image without a change in the pixels. Right? That's supervenience. So the claim is moral properties supervene on the non-moral, or at least if moral properties existed, they would supervene on the non-moral. Whenever some moral property is instantiated, this is in virtue of some non-moral property. Slavery is wrong because it instantiates a non-moral property, such as the causing of suffering. So, slavery causes suffering, that's what makes it wrong. The moral properties do not float free of the non-moral facts. They are tied to the non-moral facts. So like when a person claims that something is wrong, it's always reasonable to ask, well, what makes it wrong? And when we ask what makes it wrong, we expect them to cite some non-moral property. So, many philosophers have found it plausible to say, like, if two actions are identical in non-moral respects, then they must be identical in moral respects. Like if two people are performing exactly the same action in exactly the same context, it wouldn't make sense to say that, one of those persons is doing something right and the other is doing something wrong. There's no moral difference without a non-moral difference. So Olsson summarizes these two supervenience theses. So S1 says, necessarily for any item X that has a moral property M, X has M in virtue of some non-moral property N. The Then S2 is necessarily for any two distinct items x and y. If x and y are exactly alike in non-moral respects, x and y are exactly alike in moral respects. I should say, just as a brief note, Olson talks about moral properties and natural properties rather than moral properties and non-moral properties. I think talking of natural properties just raises other issues, so that's why I'm using the phrase non-moral properties. Anyway, these are claims about our moral concepts, about what it is to make a moral judgment. If somebody fails to accept these principles, they are just conceptually confused. They're not really making moral judgments. So if you were to say that Verity's action is wrong and Sydney's action is right, but there's just no difference at all in the non-moral properties of their actions or in the circumstances in which those actions occur, you would just be confused about what it is to judge that something is right or wrong. Okay, so like why is all this an issue? How does this relate to the queerness argument? Well, the question is, what exactly explains this supervenience? So to use Olson's example, let's suppose, for instance, that classical utilitarianism is the correct moral theory. The right action is whatever action maximizes happiness. So any action that maximizes happiness has the property of rightness. Whenever an action has the property of maximizing happiness, it has the property of rightness, where the property of rightness is not simply identical to maximizing happiness. Rather, maximizing happiness is what makes actions morally right. And this is necessarily the case. In every possible world, maximizing happiness is connected to moral rightness. How can this be? There is a necessary connection between completely distinct properties, right? We have the property of happiness and the property of rightness or goodness. Now, these properties are not identical. If they were identical, that would be moral naturalism. So they're not identical, they're distinct properties. But there is this necessary connection where in every possible world, the property of happiness is connected to the property of moral goodness. But how can such a necessary connection obtain between completely distinct properties? This is what is queer. So some philosophers endorse a metaphysical principle known as Hume's dictum, which says that there are no necessary connections between distinct properties. So as Hume puts it, I quote, "There is no object which implies the existence of another if we consider these objects in themselves." He talks about objects, we can simply talk about properties. So for any two distinct properties, it's possible for those properties to come apart. In principle, any property can be combined with any other, provided the two properties are genuinely distinct. So if you think about like cases where there are necessary connections, well, arguably there's a necessary connection between water and H2O. In every possible world, when you have water, you have H2O. But this is because water just is H2O. Water just is a collection of H2O molecules. Those properties are not actually distinct. Where the properties are distinct, there's no necessary connection between them, and if there's no necessary connection between them, that means they can come apart. So maybe like it could be that in our world all emeralds are green, but being an emerald and being green are distinct properties. So there could have been a world where emeralds appeared a different color. Maybe our visual systems evolved differently, or the laws of nature governing light were different, or whatever. So we can have like the emerald, but we can have it with a different color because these properties are distinct. Anyway, this gives us the argument. Moral properties, if they exist, are distinct from non-moral properties. That's uncontroversial assumption of moral non-naturalism. Moral properties, if they exist, necessarily supervene on the non-moral properties, but there are no necessary connections between distinct properties, so moral properties do not exist. Now, of course, the key part of this argument is Hume's dictum, which is very controversial. As Olson notes, many philosophers think that there are counterexamples to this dictum. So consider, for instance, impossible properties. It is impossible for something to be a round square. Necessarily, there are no round squares. Similarly, it is impossible for something to be the last digit of pi. Necessarily, there is no last digit of pi. Now, if we accept Hume's dictum, there cannot be necessary connections between distinct properties, then the property of being a round square and the property of being the last digit of pi turn out to be the same. And this is because they both fail to be instantiated in every possible world. There is no possible world in which one of them is instantiated but the other is not, because there is no possible world in which either is instantiated. So they end up being necessarily coextensive. Neither is instantiated in any possible world. So yeah, if Hume's dictum is right, then it looks like these end up being just the same property. But that, the argument goes that, well, that's just the wrong result. Surely those properties are different. Another potential counterexample cited by Olson is being the first positive even number and being the positive square root of 4. These are properties of the number 2. They're necessarily coextensive. In every possible world, there is a first positive even number, and it is the positive square root of 4. These properties of the number 2 cannot come apart, but arguably, they're distinct properties. Now, that is obviously controversial. You know, you might say, no, being the first positive even number just is the positive square root of 4. These are just different ways of referring to the same property. I mean, a lot of this is going to depend on how exactly we conceive of property identity, whatever, but you know, this is just one line we might take, right? These might be counterexamples to Hume's dictum. One thing I think that's worth bearing in mind, though, is that even if we reject Hume's dictum, we might think there still remains an issue here. So let's say that there are cases where distinct properties can be necessarily coextensive. Right, so maybe we say, yeah, okay, being the first positive even number and being the positive square root of 4 are distinct properties. They're distinct properties that are necessarily coextensive. But, you know, arguably there's a pretty straightforward explanation of why this is. Like, we can do some simple mathematics to understand why these distinct properties are necessarily coextensive, right? I understand the number line, I understand how to calculate square roots, I find that in both cases I arrive at the number 2, you know. Moreover, these are both mathematical properties, right? They're both the same kind of property. Now, in the case of moral properties, by contrast, the worry would be that this necessary connection between the non-moral properties and the moral properties is just sort of brute, right? There's no explanation of why the non-moral properties realize these moral properties. And more importantly, these are completely different kinds of properties. So remember, we're assuming that moral naturalism fails. In the case of, you know, classical utilitarianism, for example, the property of happiness and the property of moral goodness are completely different things. Happiness is a mental state, it's part of the causal order. Moral goodness is non-natural, non-causal, abstract. Why would these properties be necessarily connected? And of course, this is going to be an issue regardless of which non-moral properties the moral properties supposedly supervene on. So maybe, you know, even if we abandon Hume's dictum, we might think, no, there's still some unresolved issue here. There's still something queer about this idea of the fact that, like, the moral properties are necessarily coextensive with certain other types of natural properties. Okay, another version of the queerness argument alleges that moral properties, if they existed, would intrinsically have motivational force. So here's how Mackie puts it. He says, an objective good would be sought by anyone who was acquainted with it, not because of any contingent fact that this person, or every person, is so constituted that he desires this end, but just because the end has to-be-pursuedness somehow built into it. So acquaintance with the moral facts would be intrinsically motivating, right? We would be motivated to act in accordance with them just by kind of like knowing them, just by kind of having this like direct knowledge of them. That would like force us to act in accordance with them. Moral goodness would somehow make us pursue it, compel us to pursue it. Moral properties make us act. So, you know, I know that slavery is wrong, and I am thereby motivated not to enslave people. Now, one reason we might find this queer is that many people are attracted to a kind of Humeanism about motivation. Beliefs in themselves never motivate, only desires motivate. No information about the world, no acquaintance with facts in the world can in itself motivate me to do anything. suppose I discover that my house is on fire, right? And I can see the fire, I can smell the smoke. I'm very directly acquainted with the burning of the house, and I know that if I remain sitting here, I'm going to burn to death slowly and painfully. Well, I'm only going to be motivated to get up and run out the house if I additionally have the desire not to burn to death. Without that desire, I'm not going to try to save myself. I'll just sit here and burn. So I think this is a fairly commonsensical picture of psychology, right? It's like, the external world can't in itself make you do anything. You need the right internal psychology. You need to have the right sorts of desires. So, I need to have not just acquaintance with the burning of the house. I need to have the desire to save my own life, or the desire to avoid burning. Now, moral facts, if they existed, would have motivational force. Acquaintance with the moral facts is in itself enough to move us. By coming to know that, P is wrong, I'm motivated not to do P. But how could a fact motivate while, bypassing my desires like that? It's as if I'm hypnotized by the moral facts, as if the moral facts somehow set up reverberations in my brain so as to make me move. That's a remarkable power, especially for a property that's not part of the part of the domain of empirical science. So this does seem queer. The main problem with this line of argument is moral realists do not need to hold that moral facts have this motivational force. So the worry here is just Mackie is straw-manning the moral realist. Certainly the view that moral judgments necessarily motivate us, that is controversial. It's very controversial whether it's part of our ordinary moral concepts that when we are acquainted with a moral property, it compels us to act in particular ways. Most contemporary realists would deny this. There is no guarantee that people will do what they ought to do, even when they know full well what they ought to do. So I think the force of this version of the queerness argument is at best very limited to specific forms of realism, and those are probably forms of realism that very, very few realists will endorse. Indeed, as we've already noted, most contemporary non-naturalists will say that moral properties are non-causal. Some people view this as literally defining the distinction between moral naturalism and moral non-naturalism. So like literally they'll say, what it is to be a moral non-naturalist is to think that moral properties are non-causal. But if moral properties are non-causal, well, clearly they can't cause us to do anything. So this motivational force argument would not get off the ground with that version of moral non-naturalism. Okay, the next version of the queerness argument, and the one that Olson thinks is the strongest, is irreducible normativity. So here's what Mackie says. He says, if there were objective principles of right and wrong, any wrong possible course of action would have a not-to-be-doneness somehow built into it. He also says, objective wrongness in itself gives or constitutes a reason for not doing the wrong action. So the thought is that the moral facts, if there were moral facts, the moral facts favour or disfavour particular courses of action. It's as though there is a judgment without a judger. And note the difference between this and the argument from motivation. Some property might favour a particular action without making us perform the action, without motivating us to perform the action. So, moral facts are irreducibly normative. They're facts that count in favour of particular actions, or facts that give reasons for particular actions, where this cannot be reduced to straightforward descriptive claims. And the thought here is that what's queer is the reasons relation, right? The fact that slavery causes suffering is a reason not to enslave people. So there's a special kind of relation between, one property, the suffering caused by slavery, and then potential courses of action. Moral facts contrast with cases of reducible normativity. So we make many normative claims about what we ought to do or what we have reason to do. But very often these normative claims can be reduced to descriptive claims about desires or codes or rules. So think about hypothetical imperatives, which have the form, if you want X, you ought to do Y. So let's say it's raining, right? I might I might look out the window and say, oh, you ought to put on a coat. What I'm saying here really is, if you want to stay dry, you ought to put on a coat. We can take this as a way of expressing that putting on a coat is a means of staying dry. And obviously I can, release myself from this imperative by changing my desires. If I don't desire to stay dry, then it's no longer the case that I ought to put on a coat. Or consider rules, like the rules of chess. When playing chess, you ought not to move the rook diagonally. What this means is simply that moving the rook diagonally is against the rules of chess. We could, of course, choose to play a different game using the same pieces. Maybe that game would allow us to move the rook diagonally, but as long as we're playing chess, you ought not to move the rook diagonally. That's just what the rules of chess require. So in this case, the norm, right, the claim about what you ought to do or what you have reason to do is just reduced to a particular convention, right? It's the convention of how we have set up the rules of chess. Or consider codes that govern institutions. Take something like attorney-client privilege. It's part of the role of being an attorney that you respect attorney-client privilege. So if you're an attorney, you ought to respect attorney-client privilege. Now, notice that in an important sense, this obligation is independent of your desires, right? Maybe, like, let's say you're an attorney and you don't desire to comply with attorney-client privilege. Maybe you hate your client. Maybe you've been offered money to violate it. Still, you have this role, you're part of this institution, and as such, I might kind of judge you from that perspective and talk about what you have reason to do. And I might say, well, you ought to, right? You have reason to respect attorney-client privilege because that is what it is. That is what is just part of the role of the attorney. Talk of reasons in this case is a way of describing the social conventions that govern the practice of law. So, essentially, what we have in the case of reducible normativity is, we specify some sort of end or goal, or maybe rule of an institution, and then we specify means of achieving that end. And the key point is that there is nothing more to these reducible norms than these, rules, conventions, means-end relationships. So, when I say you ought not to move the rook diagonally, in the context of a chess game, that's just a way of expressing that, we are playing chess and it's part of the rules of chess that you do not move the rook diagonally. Talk of oughts and reasons just drops out. So essentially, in the case of reducible normativity, we can make the same points using non-normative language. So in a sense, it's not just that the normativity is reducible, it's eliminated, right? These analyses eliminate the normative. So let's say, so I look out the window, I see that it's raining, and I say, you ought to put on a coat. Well, in that context, what I'm expressing is something like this. I'm saying, you have the desire to stay dry, putting on a coat is a means of staying dry, and putting on a coat does not frustrate any of your other desires. None of these are normative claims. None of these say anything about what you ought to do, or about what you have reason to do. The normativity has just been eliminated in favour of these purely descriptive claims about desires and means of satisfying desires. Similarly, when I say you ought to move the rook you ought not to move the rook diagonally, what I'm saying is like, okay, you're playing chess, it's against the rules of chess to move the rook diagonally. Again, there's no normativity here. There's no ought, there's no reason. The normativity has dropped out in favour of just straightforward descriptive claims. So this is how we understand a lot of our normative language, at least according to Olson. By contrast, moral reasons are irreducibly normative. So we take a moral claim, such as you morally ought not to own slaves. This is so, regardless of whether it would satisfy any of your ends, regardless of whether any institutions permit the owning of slaves. There have obviously been institutions that have permitted slave ownership. What we would say is that those institutions were wrong. Anybody who worked in such institutions was doing something they ought not to have done. So we can say that, like, F is an irreducibly normative reason for S to do X, just in case this reason cannot be cashed out in terms of desires or conventions. This is the difference between, like, moral rules and the rules of chess, for example. You can't just decide to ignore the moral rules in the way that you can decide not to play chess, or in the way that, like, social conventions can change. Or, well, I mean, I suppose you have the ability to ignore moral rules, but you ought not to. You ought to obey morality, period. There's no way to catch this out in terms of purely descriptive claims. It's not just that, like, so when I say that you ought not to own slaves, it's not just that, you know, well, you happen to be following the moral rules and enslaving people violates the moral rules. No, it's that you ought to follow the moral rules. You have a reason to follow the moral rules, regardless of any goals or conventions or anything else. And so the question then is, well, how could there be these irreducibly normative relations? I mean, what even is it for something to be an irreducibly normative relation? This, Olson says, is what is objectionably queer about morality. When we make many other types of normative claims, we can express the same points using straightforward descriptive claims. So that's how we can kind of come to an understanding of them. But when we make these irreducibly normative claims, it's just like it's just this kind of brute normative relation in the world, and that is queer. However, Olson also himself points out, well, it does seem open to the moral realist to just deny that there's anything queer about irreducible normativity. So Olson says, and I quote, "They could maintain that it is a fundamental fact about reality that there are irreducibly normative reason relations, and they could refuse head-on to admit that there is anything queer about such relations." So this forces the question, okay, what exactly is queer about irreducible normativity? Interestingly, Olson himself doesn't actually give any further explanation. He says it's just it's just bedrock. It's just like a bedrock intuition, bedrock metaphysical intuition. Some people find irreducible normativity objectionable, some people don't, and that's that. We end up with a stalemate. That's Olson's own diagnosis, which is, I think, not a particularly good position if the queerness argument is supposed to be the central plank in the case against moral realism. Obviously, anybody who doesn't share the intuition that there's something queer about irreducible normativity is not going to be persuaded by this argument. And indeed, even if you do share that intuition, you might think that there are arguments in favour of moral realism that outweigh the feeling that there's something weird about irreducible normativity. So that's that's where we are now. A final way to understand the queerness argument is proposed by Luke Taylor in the article "What's So Queer About Morality?" Taylor suggests that moral reasons are grounded in the idea that the world should be a certain way, or the world is meant to be a certain way. So let's say that Sydney is in pain. Verity can give him painkillers at no cost to herself. We would say then that Verity has a moral reason to give Sydney painkillers. Why? Well, what this amounts to, as Taylor sees it, is that the world should be such that if Sydney is in pain and Verity can give Sydney painkillers, then Verity will give him the painkillers. So the world should be such that we help each other, that we alleviate suffering where we can at no cost to ourselves, and so on. For the moral realist, this is an objective fact. It's just as objective as any descriptive claim. And this, Taylor says, is where the queerness of moral properties lies. The issue here isn't really about reasons on Taylor's view. So, we're happy with the claim that the world is a certain way. Okay, so claims about how the world is, right? Straightforward descriptive propositions. We're happy with those, but those sorts of claims also support reasons. So the world is such that if Verity gives Sydney the painkillers, Sydney's pain will be alleviated. Nothing strange about that. Well, suppose we add that Verity desires to alleviate Sydney's pain. Again, nothing strange about that. So, we have these two straightforward descriptive claims, right? Verity desires to alleviate Sydney's pain. Giving him the painkillers would alleviate his pain. And this gives Verity a reason to give Sydney the painkillers, right? We would then say, okay, well, Verity ought to give Sydney the painkillers then, right? The fact that Verity desires to alleviate Sydney's pain and that giving him the painkillers would alleviate his pain, that gives Verity a reason to give Sydney the painkillers. So in this case, reasons are reduced to straightforward descriptive claims. But notice that in a similar sense, moral reasons are actually reducible. Moral reasons are reducible to claims about how the world should be. So let's say the world should be such that we help alleviate the suffering of others. Giving Sidney the painkillers would help alleviate his suffering, hence Verity has a reason to give Sidney the painkillers. Right? Giving Sidney the painkillers is a means for bringing about how the world should be. So what's the difference between these two cases? I mean, in both cases, we're cashing out reasons in terms of facts about the world. In one case, facts about Verity's desires. In the other case, facts about the way the world should be. Well, the difference is, we're happy to postulate desires, but facts about the way the world should be seem rather more strange. So here's the analogy, right? We have desire-based reasons, right, where we say you desire X. Y is an effective means of achieving X, so you have a reason to do X. Then we can think of like convention-based reasons. So your institutional role requires X. Y is an effective means of achieving X, so you have a reason to do Y. Then there's moral reasons. The world should be such that X. Y is an effective means of achieving X, so you have a reason to do Y. The problem is not with the idea of irreducible reasons, because if reasons can be said to be reducible in one case, they're surely reducible in all the other cases. The problem is with the claim that there is any way that the world should be, or at least, like, objectively, there is a way that the world should be. So on Taylor's view, the queerness of morality has nothing to do with reasons for actions. It's not the reasons that are queer. It's the idea that the world objectively should be a certain way. The world itself makes demands of us. It requires us to do one thing rather than another. It's as if the universe itself had preferences, had likes or dislikes. I mean, we can make sense of organisms with minds having preferences. But what sense is there in the idea of preferences somehow inhering in the very fabric of the universe, independent of any of the idiosyncratic preferences of individual organisms? Indeed, notice that this would remain queer even if we were to deny that it provides us with reasons. Indeed, there are some moral realists who do not frame moral realism in terms of reasons for action. Maybe morality only provides you with reasons if you happen to care about morality. But look, whether it gives us reasons or not, the notion that the world objectively should be a certain way, that is strange. So I mean, consider it this way, right? Like, when we make descriptive claims about the world, we might kind of metaphorically think about this as like drawing a little picture of the world. So Verity steals candy from Sidney. So there's like an object, Verity, another object, Sidney, and they relate to each other in a particular way. When we make moral claims, it's as if there's this like second picture of the world, different from the original picture, somehow standing outside of it and like displaying the direction that the original picture needs to take. Sort of like the storyboard for a film or something. Like, this is the way it needs to go. Verity should not steal candy from Sidney. In this picture, again, there's Verity and there's Sidney, but they relate to each other differently. This tells us how the world should be. But what on earth is, like, what is this? What makes this picture true? I say the first picture is true because it corresponds to the objects that actually exist, and I can confirm its truth by going out and making observations. For the second picture, things are more mysterious, right? Like, I can make sense of people having preferences. I might say, I want the world to be the way that this second picture depicts. But the moral realist seems to be postulating some like objective preference, some preference that's not had by any individual. And Taylor says, well, that's queer. Of course, again, we run into the issue that we saw with the previous point about irreducible normativity, which is it does again seem open to a moral realist to just say, nope, that's not queer. and then what do we say? Where do we go then? This seems to be just another case of a sort of bedrock intuition. So one person says the world objectively should be a certain way. Another person says that's queer. So one person finds that it's perfectly acceptable. The other person finds it's queer. How do we adjudicate between these two intuitions? Okay, so, well, that was the metaphysical queerness argument. Now, I noted at the beginning that the queerness argument has these two different prongs. There is the metaphysical part and the epistemological part. More emphasis has been placed on the metaphysical part, but I'll end by saying something about the epistemological part. So, as we saw, Mackie's claim is that if there were objective moral values, our knowledge of them could only come about through some special faculty, which is unlike any of our other faculties for learning about things. Let's suppose that, slavery has the property of wrongness. Well, how could I know this? Well, let's sort of think about how you come to know other things, right? So, okay, we're saying, right, slavery is wrong, has the property of wrongness. How do I come to know the property of wrongness? Well, I don't learn about it through observation. I can't just, see or touch the wrongness of slavery. Similarly, if I get an instrument like a microscope, okay, I'm not going to see the wrongness properties through the microscope. Moral properties do not reveal themselves in perception. Similarly, we don't learn about moral properties through introspection. So if you turn your attention to your own mind, you're going to find all sorts of experiences. There's pleasures and pains, likes and dislikes, various emotions, all of this. But you're not going to find rightness and wrongness. So we don't introspect the moral properties. Also, Mackie says we don't learn about moral properties through developing and testing explanatory hypotheses, such as how we developed the Big Bang hypothesis as the best explanation of various phenomena. So with the Big Bang hypothesis, you can sort of say, well, we make all of these observations, observations of things like redshift, observations of cosmic microwave background radiation, and we come up with a model which which tries to sort of fit these phenomena into a certain set of causes. Coming to learn the moral properties, we don't seem to apply that sort of reasoning. Nor does it seem that we learn about the moral properties through conceptual analysis or through, working out logical entailments. And it doesn't seem like any combination of these would help either. The best we can do, according to Mackie, is postulate a special sort of moral intuition. I just have the intuition. Ultimately, what it comes down to is I just have the intuition that some things are right, some things are wrong. But why suppose that this intuition is tracking facts in the world rather than merely being an expression of my own values and attitudes? I mean, here the issue is not the queerness of the moral properties, it's the queerness of the faculty by which we detect the moral properties. I mean, we can understand how a faculty like perception gives us knowledge of the world. So for sight, for instance, light bounces off objects, enters our eyes. So the objects in the world have like a causal influence on us. That's a very simplified and brief sketch of what's going on, obviously. But there's at least some skeleton of an understanding of how I'm hooked up to the world, of how how perception hooks me up to the world. But there's no such story that can be told for this special sort of intuition that detects moral properties. Now, probably the main reason why this argument has not been so influential is that moral realists have proposed various answers to moral epistemology. Mackie says that detecting moral properties would require a special sort of intuition, but the moral realists might object, well, no, it doesn't require a special sort of intuition. All that's required is ordinary intuition, just standard intuition, not some special faculty of intuition. Bog standard intuition will do well enough. So in general, the argument would go, we can come to know things through intuition, not just the moral facts, but various other facts as well. So arguably, basic principles of logic and mathematics are known through intuition. We don't perceive the law of non-contradiction, nor do we propose it as part of an explanatory hypothesis. No, it's sort of self-evident. It's something that is that kind of has to be presupposed in whenever we propose any explanatory hypothesis, for instance, that's going to presuppose the law of non-contradiction. So this is something that is known through a kind of intellectual intuition. It's not something we reason our way towards in the way that we would reason our way towards the Big Bang hypothesis. It's not something that's observed. It's not something that's introspected. We have an intellectual capacity to recognize and understand these self-evident truths. Maybe moral truths work the same sort of way. Or consider things like, philosophical questions, such as whether there are abstract objects, whether God exists, whether there's a compelling response to skeptical arguments, or indeed whether there are any objective moral facts. Moral realists might say that in all these cases we have to appeal to intuition. So, intuitions about basic epistemological principles. Indeed, we've already seen that the queerness argument itself arguably ultimately just rests on an intuition. It rests on the intuition that, say, irreducible normativity is queer. And then I guess also the intuition that queer things don't exist, maybe. So this is one sort of line we might take in response. Moreover, many realists have argued that actually we can come to know moral properties through perception, or through framing explanatory hypotheses, or through conceptual analysis. I have videos on all of these things, and I will link them in the comments, but just for one example, so with respect to inference to the best explanation, Michael Huemer has argued that objective moral properties are part of the best explanation of certain phenomena, namely the convergence on liberal values that has occurred over the last few hundred years. So Huemer thinks that the best way to explain the convergence on liberalism is that people are coming to realize the fact that liberalism is morally right. That's the basic idea. So we're treating moral properties as explanatory posits, and then they can be assessed according to the explanatory virtues that we use when assessing any other theoretical posit. So yeah, there's nothing extravagant about the cognitive faculties that realists posit to account for moral knowledge. We do have a faculty of intuition, and we have intuitions about many things, not just moral intuitions, and intuition is in general a way of developing knowledge. And also we can arrive at moral knowledge through other ordinary faculties like inference to the best explanation. Well, that was the queerness argument. Those were a few different ways of understanding what the queerness argument is doing. And I think I'm going to leave it there. So thanks for watching. I hope you found that interesting, and I will see you next time. Bye, everybody.